Hey everybody, it's nutritionist Amy Berger from 2itnutrition.com bringing you the next installment in doing keto without the crazy. Today we have a very important topic to get to. It is PCOS, as you can tell from the video title, but before we do that, as usual, we have some business to discuss. I will put a link to a new tab on my blog where I'm going to have the upcoming events where you can meet me. So rather than going through all those different places where you can meet me, there'll be a tab on my website now, 2itnutrition.com, where you can see where I will be speaking live in person. So you can come check me out and meet me. And let's see. If you are struggling to lose fat on keto, and I know none of you are, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, do check out the tab also on my website that says, I think it says page 4, Keto Fat Loss. That is the simplest, most straightforward, most uncomplicated way to do keto effectively. It's the page 4 diet from Dr. Eric Westman. Full disclosure, I am an affiliate. I do receive a small percentage from those sales, but it is worth every penny. Okay, moving along. I have been writing my blog for 7 years, and it only recently occurred to me that in all that time I have not written about PCOS. How crazy is that? I've written it, considering everything I've written about insulin, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, obesity, I am honestly like stunned that I never wrote about PCOS. I even wrote a post about what they call the male equivalent of PCOS. It's how chronically high insulin affects all these different men's health issues. And I didn't even write about the actual PCOS. So, situation has been remedied. I'll put a link to the blog post in the video, but today's going to be a little bit of a departure from my normal video style. I actually printed out the text of the blog post and I'm going to read it, because that way I won't forget anything. I will emphasize what I want to emphasize, but I do recommend, checking out the actual post if you want to, because then there's all these links to the research you can check out. I'm not making this stuff up. And there's also a very nice illustration of the hormonal cascades and what's happening in PCOS, why women with PCOS have the symptoms and the issues that they do. It shows you all the different feedback loops and like testosterone, estrogen, luteinizing hormone, all this stuff. So, and that's not something you can see on this video. So I am going to read it, and I guess before I start, all of my passion is going to come out when I read it, but if you're struggling with PCOS or you know someone who is, please send them a link to this video, please have them watch it. And if you know a man who has erectile dysfunction that is unrelated to like a physical trauma or depression or he just can't get it up for some unknown reason, or a man with what they call BPH, benign prostate hyperplasia or benign prostate hypertrophy. It's enlargement of the prostate gland that is not prostate cancer. If you know a dude dealing with some of that stuff, send them the link to the post that I'm going to link to in the notes on the male equivalent of PCOS, because, surprise, surprise, those are driven by chronically high insulin. Erectile dysfunction, guys, that's not a libido problem. It's not a lack of desire. It's an insulin problem, and so is BPH. All right, let's get into things. Some of this might sound a little strange because I have links, and so we'll just see how this goes as I read. As I mentioned in the previous post, I've been plugging away at this blog since 2012. It's hard to believe it's been 7 years, but even harder to believe that in all that time, I've completely neglected the topic of polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. I've written a ton about insulin, glucagon, thyroid hormones, digestion, cancer, and more, but not one word about PCOS except for a brief mention in this post, and I linked to that male PCOS post. This is a glaring omission because PCOS is a huge issue for reproductive aged women these days, and no surprise if I'm writing about it here, it's intimately tied to chronic hyperinsulinemia and metabolic dysregulation. A while back, I wrote about the effect of elevated insulin on men's hormones, explaining the concept of a male equivalent to PCOS. And I didn't realize that I hadn't even yet written about actual PCOS. I don't know how such a huge gap has existed on my blog for so long, but this is being corrected right now. Whew. I've seen online in various places women saying that they're at increased risk for type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome because they have PCOS. It's actually the other way around. Chronically high insulin, basically metabolic syndrome, whether you know you have it or not, is the main driver of PCOS. The reason so few women who have PCOS are aware of this is most doctors are clueless about insulin's many functions unrelated to blood sugar, and they never bother measuring insulin levels. This is a long post. Some of you are rejoicing now and others are groaning, so grab yourself a beverage of choice and a bag of pork rinds and happy reading. I have a beverage of choice here in my trusty Superman cup. If you watched that one video where I showed you I was wearing my Superman pajama pants, I told you I have a Superman thing, so all right. PCOS is a major cause of infertility, menstrual irregularity, and reduced quality of life in reproductive aged women. One study notes that PCOS is, quote, the most common endocrinopathy of reproductive aged women, affecting 6 to 10% of the population, with this going as high as 18% among certain cohorts when different diagnostic criteria are used. The PCOS Awareness Association puts the numbers at 10 million women affected worldwide. If you know a lot of women, chances are one of them, and likely more than one of them, is living with PCOS. The condition results from a cluster of hormonal abnormalities, namely elevated insulin, elevated androgens, which are male characteristic sex hormones, often reduced progesterone. These hormonal irregularities are responsible for the signs and symptoms of PCOS, which are no joke and can seriously reduce quality of life, not to mention be a roadblock to conception to those looking to have children. The main signs and symptoms of PCOS include weight gain or obesity, acne, oily skin, infertility or difficulty getting pregnant, mood swings, pelvic pain, irregular or absent periods, excess androgens, especially testosterone, anovulatory menstrual periods, meaning bleeding without ovulation, hair loss on the head or thinning of hair on the head, and hirsutism, which is basically facial hair, or may also include hair on the chest, back, abdomen, and arms. What a bummer! You lose hair from where you want it and grow hair where you don't want it. All right, a lot of women with PCOS have facial hair and or excess body hair in other places. I mean, all of us have body hair, but women with PCOS tend to have extra hair in other places. Despite the name of the syndrome, polycystic ovarian syndrome, many women diagnosed with PCOS don't actually have cysts on their ovaries, so it's a bit of a misnomer. That's right, you don't have to have cystic ovaries to be diagnosed with PCOS. Oh, that kooky conventional medicine gets me every time. According to the PCOS Awareness Association, in 2013, an independent panel of experts recommended to the National Institutes of Health that the name be changed because the name is confusing and hinders patient care and research efforts. This change has yet to occur, however. In fact, diagnostic criteria for PCOS vary, including no requirement whatsoever for cysts on the ovaries. The reason it's called a syndrome, kind of like metabolic syndrome, is that there's no single silver bullet definitive diagnostic test like there are for certain bacterial and viral infections. You get diagnosed with PCOS based on a constellation of signs and symptoms, although it's usually accompanied by blood tests for some of the hormonal imbalances mentioned earlier. There is no doubt, however, chronic hyperinsulinemia is at the heart of this condition. And I quote from a study here, hyperinsulinemia is associated with insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia associated with insulin resistance has been causally linked to all features of the syndrome, such as hyperandrogenism, reproductive disorders, acne, hirsutism, and metabolic disturbances. Did you see that part in bold? It's hard to tell here on the video, but in the blog post, that sentence is bolded. Did you see that part in bold? This is a bold statement, no pun intended. Most of the time, researchers say something is associated with something else because they're too timid to come right out and say that something is the cause of something else. Here, however, they're saying with no reservations that hyperinsulinemia is the cause of PCOS. All right, subject header here, insulin resistance and PCOS, diabetes in bearded women. PCOS has become a catch-all diagnosis for otherwise idiopathic female reproductive abnormalities. Idiopathic means something has no known cause. I prefer to call it idiopathic because things always have causes, we just haven't identified them yet. All right, meaning if a woman goes to the doctor with weird period issues, or if she's having trouble conceiving, and if she also happens to be overweight or obese, she will likely be diagnosed with PCOS without a whole lot of questions asked. This does a disservice to women because anovulation and amenorrhea, lack of a period, have many causes, including undernutrition and excessive exercise, particularly among adolescent girls and young women. It's also a disservice to all the thin women with PCOS who won't receive a proper diagnosis because the stereotypical PCOS patient is overweight. More on this in a minute, but the bottom line is a heavy-set woman is probably more likely to be suspected of having PCOS than a thinner woman who presents with the same signs and symptoms. I'm going to go off script here for a minute. This is something I write about a lot in my blog, but I haven't talked about it that much in my videos yet, so note to self, talk about this in videos more. People that have chronically high insulin can have weird, uncomfortable, terrible issues even when they are at a normal weight, whatever a quote normal weight is. You can have type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, gout, PCOS, hypertension, non-alcoholic fatty liver, all kinds of hyperinsulinemia related stuff, even when you are not overweight or obese. That is such a huge sticking point to me because I have a personal history of being overweight, you know, despite doing everything that I thought was right, low fat diet, lots of exercise, eating less, moving more, and I'm getting too far afield, but heavy people are so often blamed, right? Well, the reason you're diabetic is because you're fat. You have PCOS because you're fat. Well, you have heart disease because you're fat. Okay, great. What about all the not heavy people that have type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and PCOS and all those other things? These things affect people of all body weights. And so weight is not the cause. So to say you have PCOS because you're heavy is, pardon my language, just bullshit. It is bullshit. All right, so moving on to the script. While PCOS could easily be considered an endocrine problem, it's really more of a metabolic disorder. The good news is, because it's a hyperinsulinemic metabolic disorder, it is easily managed or treated or reversed, pick your word of choice, with, you guessed it, a low-carb or ketogenic diet. These aren't the only ways to improve PCOS. Anything that reverses chronic hyperinsulinemia would be effective, but why not go with the tried and true method for doing this? It has long been known that PCOS was associated with, if not outright caused by, blood sugar and insulin dysregulation. A phenomenon of diabetes in bearded women was recognized as early as the 1960s when doctors observed a clustering of blood sugar abnormalities or overt type 2 diabetes, hirsutism, and virilization or hyperandrogenism in women. It was originally called Achard-Thiers syndrome after the physicians who identified it, prior to its renaming as PCOS. As an aside, think back to a long time ago when they had circus sideshows. Remember the bearded lady? Illustrations or photographs usually showed her as being on the heavy side, right? I suspect that the bearded ladies from back in the day were simply women with PCOS due to hyperinsulinemia, long before anyone knew that this was simply a hormonal imbalance, and an easily treated one at that. And to think they were considered sideshow freaks. This breaks my heart. I guess maybe back then they were such a rarity that they were considered freaks, while today all of us probably know at least one gal dealing with PCOS. How sad that they didn't know more about this back then, because it's entirely treatable. It's even sadder, however, that so many doctors right now still have zero clue about the connection to insulin. Chronic hyperinsulinemia is the primary driver of PCOS, and while many people who have chronic hyperinsulinemia are overweight or obese, not everyone with PCOS is carrying extra weight. As much as 50% of women with PCOS are at a normal body weight. PCOS should not be discounted when a lean woman presents with other indicators of the condition, even in the absence of excess body weight. Researchers have identified, I quote, profound insulin resistance in PCOS patients who are obese as well as those who aren't. Yes, major metabolic dysregulations, including metabolic syndrome and/or type 2 diabetes, can occur in people of any body weight, and then I have a link to a post I wrote about that. Women with PCOS are more likely than non-PCOS women to receive a future diagnosis of hypertension, prediabetes, or type 2 diabetes, which should come as a shock to no one who's read my blog for a while. They also typically have higher insulin levels and higher HOMA-IR than women without PCOS. HOMA-IR, I'm going off script here. HOMA-IR is a measurement of insulin resistance. It is a HOMA, H-O-M-A, homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance. It's a mathematical relationship between your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose, and it is a better measurement than either of those by itself, because what HOMA-IR tells you is how hard your body has to work to keep glucose at a normal level. How much insulin does your pancreas have to pump out to keep glucose at a normal level? This is why we have millions of people with totally normal blood glucose, but they're very, very cardiometabolically sick because their insulin is sky high. So you could have a person with a fasting glucose of 81. Well, let's do the higher one. You could have somebody with a fasting glucose of 94, but a fasting insulin of 3. Or and then compare that to someone who has a fasting glucose of 82, but a fasting insulin of 28. If you only ever tested glucose, you would assume the person with the fasting glucose in the 80s is much healthier, much more metabolically healthy than the person with the fasting glucose in the 90s. But then you check the insulin, and then you see the real story. The person with the lower glucose, with the sky-high insulin, is in way, way worse metabolic shape than the person with slightly elevated glucose but much lower insulin. Now, if your blood sugar is 200, all bets are off, but if your blood sugar is like slightly higher than you would expect, especially on a ketogenic diet, if it's in the 90s or even the very low 101, 102, but your insulin is very low, we're not 100% sure, but most of the low carb and keto people I know, me included, we would say that the person with the lower insulin and slightly higher glucose is in a much better metabolic state. All right, back on script. I'm talking about HOMA-IR. Okay. PCOS women have significant insulin resistance that is independent of obesity, changes in body composition, and impairment of glucose tolerance. It is not obesity or hyperglycemia that results in PCOS, but rather hyperinsulinemia that drives the hormonal aberrations in PCOS with or without excess body fat and with or without elevated glucose. This is a point I've harped on in several blog posts in the past and will continue to point out in the future. It's a huge sticking point for me that excess weight is so often blamed for every health problem under the sun, when the truth is, for most people, excess body fat is the result of metabolic dysregulation rather than the cause. And I have a link to a snarky but educational blog post I wrote about that. It's a sticking point because of the bias and stigma heavy people face while simply trying to exist in the world and be treated with the same human dignity afforded to thinner people as a matter of course. Remember when I wrote about the work of Dr. Joseph Kraft, who uncovered the huge scope of high insulin even in people with normal glucose? In a perfect demonstration of Dr. Kraft's findings regarding diabetes in situ, that's the high insulin in the presence of normal glucose, he called that diabetes in situ, even among those with normal glucose tolerance, normal glucose levels, compared to healthy controls matched for age and BMI, women with PCOS had higher values for post-load 2-hour glucose, fasting insulin, post-load 2-hour insulin, and HOMA-IR, meaning the Kraft test by this guy Joseph Kraft is an oral glucose tolerance test, except instead of only measuring glucose, they measure insulin and glucose, and instead of it being a 2-hour test, it's a 5-hour test. So let's see. Oh, but they only did, this is the normal glucose test, but they also tested insulin. So women with PCOS and normal glucose tolerance showed higher insulin resistance than controls, matched for age, BMI, and pancreatic beta cell function. In plain English, even in women with normal glucose responses to the oral glucose tolerance test, those with PCOS had higher insulin, both fasting and in response to the oral glucose load. compared to women who don't have PCOS but were the same age and BMI. So you can see here again that it's not about body weight, because two women at the same BMI can have wildly different insulin levels in response to the same amount of glucose. Can we please stop blaming everything on weight? In performing hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp studies, researchers have observed that both obese and lean women with PCOS have some degree of insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is implicated in the ovulatory dysfunction of PCOS by disrupting the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. The actions of insulin influence a cascade of effects in other hormones, and this has profound ramifications for the menstrual cycle, fertility, and overall quality of life for women with PCOS. Superman to the rescue, as always. Oh, that's okay, now you can see him. There he is. All right, hormonal abnormalities in PCOS. Chronically elevated insulin stimulates ovarian and adrenal androgen production and decreases levels of sex hormone binding globulin. Hyperinsulinemia contributes to elevated androgens, testosterone, through multiple mechanisms. It augments luteinizing hormone stimulated androgen production by the ovaries. I know this is kind of complex, don't worry about it, like it's all in plain English later on. Resulting in increased free testosterone levels. Sex hormone binding globulin is important. Certain hormones don't travel through the bloodstream on their own all the time. A portion of them is free. Think free T3 or free T4 if you read my thyroid post or you know about thyroid hormones. A portion of them is free and a portion is bound to a binding globulin or a binding protein. If hormones traveled in the blood always free, they might have unwanted effects in tissues they're not supposed to affect. The binding protein keeps them from latching onto cells willy-nilly. Sex hormone binding globulin keeps a portion of estrogen, testosterone, and dihydrotestosterone bound, protecting the body from adverse effects of the full amount of hormone being free or unbound in the bloodstream. You get what that means, right? You can't have hormones just floating around all the time, or they're going to do things they're not supposed to do in tissues, and at times they're not supposed to do it. Hormonal release and regulation is very tightly controlled, very tightly regulated. So a lot of hormones have a binding protein that escorts them through the blood until they get to where they're supposed to go. The binding protein goes away and the hormone can have the effect it's supposed to do. So women with PCOS have less sex hormone binding globulin. A lot more of their testosterone is free to have the effects that testosterone has, like giving you facial hair, making your periods all wonky, or making you not ovulate at all, giving you acne, oily skin, virilization that's like almost becoming manly. That's what virilization is. That's what testosterone does. And to be clear here, women have testosterone. It's normal. Like, it's not, testosterone is not solely a male hormone, but, you know, we're not supposed to have excess testosterone. PCOS is excess testosterone. All right, back on script here. Women with PCOS produce less sex hormone binding globulin, so less testosterone is bound and more is free. More free testosterone and more free estrogen are responsible for some of the issues women with PCOS experience. Various hormone feedback loops are altered in PCOS. Production of luteinizing hormone is increased and production of follicle stimulating hormone is decreased. This results in increased androgen synthesis and interferes with normal follicle development and ovulation. You know, follicle stimulating hormone, normally you've got all these little pre-egg cells or whatever in your ovaries that you're actually born with. You're born with these. And these hormones are intended to sprinkle, 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 and one follicle kind of becomes the dominant follicle, and it develops, and it's supposed to be ovulated. That's what the ovary sends out when you ovulate. That is impaired in PCOS because you have less follicle stimulating hormone. You have more luteinizing hormone. You have more sprinkling, sprinkling, sprinkling. So it's almost as if many follicles are stimulated, but they're not ovulated because you don't have the you don't have the follicle stimulating hormone to make the one follicle dominant and become ovulated. So this is why at least some women with PCOS do have cystic ovaries. These follicles sort of become stimulated and they just grow and they become cysts. These are where your cystic ovaries come from, and they're just not ovulated. All right. All women normally produce ovarian testosterone from luteinizing hormone stimulating predominant follicles. Yes, ladies, your ovaries produce testosterone, and this is totally normal. The issue in PCOS is that the ovaries make more testosterone than normal. In PCOS, abnormally elevated luteinizing hormone influences excessive ovarian testosterone production. A dominant follicle does not develop properly. In a healthy menstrual cycle, a dominant follicle would lead to ovulation. Rather than being ovulated, however, this follicle becomes cystic. Insulin in the brain could possibly drive abnormal luteinizing hormone hypersecretion, which then drives the ovarian testosterone hyperproduction, right? It seems that the elevated luteinizing hormone in the brain cascades through the body and causes the body to produce more testosterone. Interventions that reduce insulin levels may help normalize these other hormones and allow the cycle to operate normally. So I'm going to skip. I have a paragraph written here about that illustration I told you about, but I'll just put that in the notes. Dietary influences on PCOS. Let's talk about how what we eat affects the ovaries, menstruation, PCOS. Ketogenic and low-carb diets as therapeutic interventions for PCOS are underrepresented in the medical literature. Considering how effective they are for lowering insulin levels, there should be a zillion studies on this. Instead, there's a distinct paucity. Weight loss is cited as frontline therapy, but do doctors ever advise patients about how effective low-carb and keto are for fat loss? And one more time for the people in the back, what about PCOS patients who are not overweight? What are they supposed to do? Lose 50 pounds they don't have to lose? What women with PCOS should be informed of is that their condition is coming from chronically high insulin, and whether or not they're carrying excess body fat, a low-carb or ketogenic diet is a dynamite way to bring down insulin levels. A review, and again, I have links to all the papers that are mentioned throughout this post are linked in the blog post. You can click on and reading yourself. A review of nutritional management in women with PCOS mentioned a low-calorie diet with limited intake of simple sugars and refined carbs and increased intake of low glycemic foods. It was also suggested to reduce saturated fat and trans fat. I can get behind decreasing consumption of simple sugars, refined carbs, and trans fats, but why the low calories and restricted saturated fat? Not necessary. Again, should a woman with PCOS who's at a normal weight be advised to follow a low-calorie diet? If so, why? She's not looking to lose weight. And if not, what's the alternative? If weight loss is not an issue, what's a woman with PCOS to do when lose weight is the go-to recommendation? Bang head against desk, right? Low-carb or ketogenic diets promote fat loss partly through lower insulin, but they can normalize insulin levels even in people who are not overweight. For this reason, normalization of insulin, low-carb diets are ideal for restoration of normal hormone signaling and healthy reproductive function regardless of body weight or BMI. In a systematic review of low-carb diets on fertility, hormones, and outcomes in overweight and obese women, now they didn't all have PCOS, but it was a study on fertility, hormones, and outcomes in women that were overweight or obese. The individual studies examined had mixed findings, but on balance, the evidence was stacked in low-carb's favor. The authors wrote, and I quote, "Reducing carbohydrate load can reduce circulating insulin levels, improve hormonal balance, and resume ovulation to improve pregnancy rates compared to the usual diet," end quote. Color me shocked. And the kicker to this is they defined a low-carb diet as less than 45% of calories coming from carbs. LOL, lol, everyone, right? Laughing out loud. Some of the studies they included had subjects consuming less carbohydrate than their usual diet, but way more than you and I would consider truly low carb. Imagine how much more compelling the results would be if all the diets were actually low carb or ketogenic. Some of these people were eating 45% of their calories from carbs, and they still had good improvements in hormones and pregnancy outcomes. Studies employing food recall and food frequency questionnaires, which admittedly are almost worthless. If you can't remember what you had for lunch on Wednesday 3 years ago, imagine trying to account for what you've eaten over the past few years. Anyway, These studies employing these food frequency questionnaires suggest a correlation between greater intake of foods with high glycemic indexes and loads and incidence of PCOS. One case control study showed that compared to subjects without PCOS, subjects with PCOS had the same approximate total energy, total calorie intake, but the women with PCOS had higher intakes of high glycemic index foods and lower intakes of vegetables and legumes than the controls. Studies like this can't establish a causal relationship, but considering the undeniable driving role of hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance in this condition, it seems reasonable to speculate that diets high in high glycemic carbs and low in fiber could potentially contribute to the etiology of PCOS. I have to say, though, that I really dislike the concept of glycemic index and glycemic load. They're helpful as a basic, very basic framework. Things like maple syrup or blueberry muffins are probably going to affect most people's blood sugar and insulin levels much more than something like spinach or mushrooms. But things get a bit murkier when comparing foods that are both relatively high in carbs. For example, a cookie versus a banana. Experiments have been done looking at glucose responses in many different people in response to many different foods, and the researchers were surprised to see radical differences in glucose responses. One person's high fiber whole grain bread is another's white bread with grape jelly. In the author's own words, quote, "Here we have continuously monitored week-long glucose levels." I think these people wore CGMs, the continuous glucose monitors. "We continuously monitored week-long glucose levels in an 800-person cohort, 800 people, measured responses to 46,898 meals, and found high variability in the response to identical meals, suggesting that universal dietary recommendations may have limited utility." Universal dietary recommendations may have limited utility? You think? So much for across-the-board, low-fat, vegan, DASH, and whatever other diet they're trying to shove down our throats, literally and figuratively, right? This is a huge point. Let me take a little drink break. Two people can eat the exact same amount of the exact same food and have totally different blood sugar and insulin responses, right? This is why I say one person's bowl of beans is another person's Pop-Tart, another person's sugary marshmallow cereal, you know? So I think the glycemic index and load, they're maybe helpful as a ballpark, but how can you have a glycemic index of any food when two people eat that same exact food in the same exact amount and one person's blood sugar does this and the other person's does this? Your guess is as good as mine. With regard to glycemic responses after consuming the same foods, Erin Siegel, one of the authors on the study cited above, said, quote, "There are profound differences between individuals. In some cases, individuals have the opposite response to one another, and this is really a big hole in the literature," end quote. Talk about an understatement. Siegel also noted, quote, "After seeing this data, I think about the possibility that maybe we're really conceptually wrong in our thinking about the obesity and diabetes epidemic. The intuition of people is that we know how to treat these conditions, and it's just that people are not listening and are eating out of control. But maybe people are actually compliant, but in many cases we were giving them the wrong advice." Hello. Hallelujah and pass the bacon. Yes, that I wrote that in the blog. Hallelujah and pass the bacon. If you're kosher, if you keep halal, hallelujah and pass the kosher halal chicken. All right. Next section, low carb and ketogenic diets for PCOS. Now the rubber hits the road, or the scrambled eggs hit the plate. The interwebs abound with anecdotes from women successfully managing or reversing, really, PCOS with a low-carb or ketogenic diet, but published clinical trials are scarce. The great Dr. Eric Westman, who's been researching keto for 20 years, was behind one of the only ones out there, and it's a damn good one. It was very small, only 5 subjects, so that's a bummer, but it's not a reason to ignore the findings, especially when you see how powerful those findings were. Subjects were overweight or obese women with PCOS who were instructed to limit their carbohydrate intake to 20 grams or less per day for 6 months. Remember, 20 total grams or fewer is the approach Dr. Westman uses in his clinic at Duke University, the famous page 4 diet that I I think I mentioned earlier. If I didn't mention it, I don't remember if I did. I just recorded a video before this and I mentioned it. Page 4 diet on my website, 2itnutrition.com. There's a tab that says page 4 keto fat loss. Oh, I remember I said, because I said if you're struggling with fat loss and nobody is, yes, I did mention it. Never mind. Here's what happened in this PCOS study. Body weight down 12%. Percent free testosterone down 22%. The luteinizing hormone to follicle stimulating hormone, which is a ratio like we need to improve, down 36%. Fasting insulin down 54%. Check out that drop in fasting insulin, a 54% decrease, exclamation point. That's your smoking PCOS gun right there, dear readers or dear viewers, as the case is here. And the best part, 2 of the subjects got pregnant. Take that, PCOS. As I mentioned at the very start of this post, PCOS is a major cause of infertility. It accounts for as much as 80% of anovulatory infertility cases, and as 70 to 80% of women with PCOS have infertility. 70 to 80% of women with PCOS have infertility. And 2 out of the 5 women in the study conceived after a few months on a low-carb diet, despite previous failed attempts to conceive. Granted, these are very small numbers and correlation is not causation, but come on. If you've understood anything about the role of insulin in affecting multiple reproductive hormones, it's not a huge logical leap to suggest that lowering insulin levels via the very low-carb study diet probably played a role in these conceptions. Now, let's talk a little bit more about infertility for a sec here. Getting pregnant should be easy. It's damn near the most natural thing in the world. When I was a kid, our junior high school health classes were basically nothing but lessons in how not to get pregnant, because teenage pregnancy was such a big concern, and it seemed like unless you took heroic measures to protect yourself, odds were you would get pregnant. Things have changed a lot in the decades since then. Now, couples trying to conceive struggle like never before. They pay tens of thousands of dollars or more for advanced testing, fertility treatments, hormones injections, in vitro fertilization, and other interventions in the hopes of having a child. Getting pregnant should not be this difficult. Now, of course, there's approximately 4 zillion different reasons why attempting to conceive can be unsuccessful. PCOS is only one thing on a long list of issues that can interfere with a woman's fertility, and goodness knows men have difficulty fathering a child for an endless list of their own reasons. I mean absolutely no offense to anyone who desires to have a child and has experienced the devastation of that not happening. I'm only trying to point out that PCOS is a major cause of infertility for women, and it's an issue that was very rare until recently. It existed a while back, yes, remember that the diabetes of the bearded woman from the 1960s, but it was rare. Just like type 2 diabetes, obesity, and metabolic syndrome were once rare. All of these conditions have exploded in incidence in the past few decades, and it's really no mystery why. They all come from the same underlying problem. A systematic review that looked at the effects of different diets for the management of PCOS found, quote, this is like a separate quote here, greater weight loss for a monounsaturated fat-enriched diet, improved menstrual regularity for a low glycemic index diet, increased free androgen index for a high carbohydrate diet, increased androgens for the high carb diet, greater reductions in insulin resistance, fibrinogen, and HDL cholesterol, what? For a low carbohydrate or low glycemic index diet, improved quality of life for a low glycemic index diet, and improved depression and self-esteem for a high protein diet. A study of 60 overweight or obese women with PCOS compared the effects of a conventional hypocaloric diet, only 15% of energy from protein, and a modified hypocaloric diet, getting 30% of energy from protein, plus low glycemic food. So the conventional hypocaloric diet was 15% of energy diet. The modified hypocaloric diet, 30% of energy from protein. They're both low calorie diets, but one has double the protein of the other. After 12 weeks, so it was a 12-week study, weight loss was similar in the two groups, and mean testosterone level decreased in both groups. follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone were unchanged by either diet, but compared to the conventional diet, only the higher protein, low glycemic diet resulted in significant decreases in insulin, HOMA-IR, and C-reactive protein, which is a marker for insulin, of inflammation, sorry. The higher protein, lower glycemic approach improved insulin and HOMA-IR while the conventional low-calorie diet didn't? You don't say. You don't frickin' say. What a frickin' shock. In a crossover study of obese women with PCOS, comparing 3 weeks of a conventional diet, which was 60% carbs and 25%, to an isocaloric higher fat diet, 40% carbs, 45% fat, both with 15% total energy from protein. So to be clear, there's 2 different diets. They both have 15% protein, which sucks, frankly. Both 15% protein, that should be higher. One diet was 60% carbs, the other was 40% carbs. So 40% carbs is still a high carb diet to you and me, but it's lower than their conventional, which was 60% carbs. All right. So let's see. The higher fat diet resulted in an impressive 30% decrease in day-long insulin levels, along with improvements in the lipid profile. Both diets were relatively low in saturated fat, less than 7% of total calories, and the increased fat in the higher fat diet, the lower carb, higher fat diet, came predominantly from mono and polyunsaturated sources. The study authors concluded, quote, replacement of dietary carbohydrate with mono or polyunsaturated fat yields clinically important reductions in day-long insulin concentrations without adversely affecting lipid profile in obese, insulin-resistant women with PCOS. Wait for it. Wait for it. This simple and safe dietary intervention may constitute an important treatment for PCOS. What? Say what? Replacing carbohydrate with fat, reduced insulin levels without wacky effects on the lipid profile, and cutting back on carbs and eating more fat is a simple and safe dietary intervention that may be an important treatment for PCOS? Insert my shocked face. This is my surprised face, that the higher fat, lower carb diet improved the hell out of insulin in obese women with PCOS. I'm so shocked, aren't you? The study was published in 2017. Since the increased fat was specifically from mono and polyunsaturated sources, I guess the authors must have missed the 2010 meta-analysis from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition looking at the association of saturated fat with cardiovascular disease. This analysis concluded that there is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk for coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease. So yeah, being that pretty much the only reason we've ever been advised to reduce saturated fat is to reduce the risk for these diseases, and there's no evidence that this reduced risk actually occurs, there's basically zero reason to cut back on saturated fat, whether you have PCOS or not. The same researchers published a separate paper in 2010 in which they wrote that replacing saturated fat, quote, with a higher carbohydrate intake, particularly refined carbohydrate intake, can exacerbate the atherogenic dyslipidemia associated with insulin resistance and obesity that includes increased triglycerides, small LDL particles, and reduced HDL cholesterol. So yeah, higher carb intake, not higher fat intake, higher carb intake worsens the lipid profile associated with insulin resistance, like the insulin resistance women with PCOS have. Another study found that after 8 weeks of a low starch, low dairy, higher fat diet, overweight and obese women with PCOS had significant increases in fat oxidation and decreases in carbohydrate oxidation. That is, they were burning more fat and less carbohydrate, deriving more of their energy from fat. The diet also resulted in a substantial reduction in fasting insulin, a mean decrease of 19.5, which is huge. An average decrease of 19 micrograms per milliliter is huge in insulin, as well as impressive weight loss. Subjects lost an average of about 8 kilograms, which is more than 17 pounds in just 8 weeks. 17 pounds, 8 kilograms in 8 weeks? I'll quote myself, that is a damn fine rate of weight loss. And no surprise whatsoever, the composition of the study diet sounds very much like a well-formulated low-carb diet. This is a direct quote of the study, of what the study diet was. The diet included ad libitum, meaning no restriction on calories, ad lib, eat as you wish. The diet included ad libitum consumption of lean animal protein, meat, chicken, turkey, other fowl, fish, shellfish, and eggs, non-starchy vegetables, fruits, including fatty fruits such as avocado and olives, nuts, seeds, and oils. Subjects older than 21 years old were allowed 1 6-ounce glass of red wine per day, and all subjects were allowed up to 1 ounce of prepared or fresh full-fat cheese per day. Cheese has not been found to be as insulinemic as other dairy products because of its low whey content, and was allowed in restricted amounts to aid in dietary compliance. Lord knows I'd be able to comply more if my diet had cheese. Now this is only 1 ounce of cheese a day, which kind of sucks, but anyway. The diet excluded all grains, refined and whole, beans, pulses, and dairy products except for the cheese, and sugar, including fruit juice from concentrate, cane sugar, beet sugar, raw turbinado sugar, evaporated cane juice, brown rice syrup, high fructose corn syrup, corn sugar, honey, or agave nectar because of their insulinemic properties. Non-nutritive sugar substitutes were allowed for participants that wished to use them. Non-nutritive sugar substitutes are artificial sweeteners, aspartame, Splenda, sucralose, whatever. Participants were not advised to count calories or carbohydrates and were encouraged to eat until they were satisfied, but not to overeat. Participants were instructed not to change their level of physical activity throughout the intervention, end quote. Now, before I get into, I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. If you haven't downloaded page 4 yet, this sounds about 94% like page 4. The only difference is they were allowed some nuts and seeds. Page 4 does not allow nuts. Alcohol is also not on page 4. And you do have to count carbs on page 4. You have to stay under 20 grams or less. But kind of the beauty of page 4, you don't have to count carbs. If you eat the way page 4 says to eat, you don't have to count because you're not going to be over 20. If you absolutely stick faithfully, you don't have to count. But this, no sugar, no grains, no beans, no pulses, no fruit, ad libitum, no limits on the poultry, the meat, the eggs, the seafood, the shellfish. This is page 4. Okay, moving on. It's noteworthy that artificial sweeteners were permitted, as some people claim that these affect insulin levels and blood glucose, but many physicians who use low-carb interventions with their patients have not found these substances to be problematic. In fact, for some people, including them makes it easier to stick to low-carb or keto for the long term because it expands food and beverage options. Be a purist if you want. I'm definitely not. But some of us like to drink things other than plain water now and then. I've used artificial sweeteners for over 20 years, and I have not found them to interfere with fat loss, nor with my metabolic markers, including fasting insulin, fasting glucose, triglycerides, and HbA1c. But you do you. If you saw my food police video, nobody is anybody else's food police. I do use artificial sweeteners. I would like to lose about 10 pounds. I could definitely stand to lose 10 pounds right now. If I had to guess as to what is making me not the weight I want, it ain't the artificial sweeteners, folks. I eat too much fat. I really just eat too much fat. All right. It's also noteworthy that the weight loss and lower insulin levels in this study were achieved without changes to subjects' usual exercise habits and without them specifically being told to cut back on calories or to count calories at all. You know what that means? It means that the dietary change alone was effective. No eat less, move more, just a low-carb diet, period. If subjects did end up eating less, it was because low-carb and keto diets tend to be more satiating and regulate appetite to the point that people spontaneously reduce their total energy intake without having to count and track everything. They eat less naturally because once blood sugar and insulin levels are stable and people are off that crazy blood sugar roller coaster, they don't need to eat several meals a day with snacks in between. This is especially interesting because a prestigious Mayo Clinic in the United States says, quote, your doctor may recommend weight loss through a low-carb, so this is for women with PCOS, obviously. Your doctor may recommend weight loss through a low-calorie diet combined with moderate exercise activities. Even a modest reduction in your weight, for example, losing 5% of your body weight, might improve your condition. Right. Or you could do a low-carb diet, not count calories, not exercise more than you already do, and somehow lower your insulin levels substantially and lose an impressive amount of weight. This isn't rocket science, ladies. I mentioned inositol. I'm going to skip over that section. If you're interested in that, feel free to email me, tuitnutrition@gmail.com, TUIT nutrition@gmail.com. If you want some supplement recommendations, or like I said, just look at this blog post. There's links even to the specific supplement that I would recommend. Basically, any compound that helps improve blood sugar or insulin levels will theoretically help in PCOS. And inositol is really good for that. Chromium is good for that. Berberine is good for that. Lipoic acid is good for that. So I'm not making any recommendations here. You can, like I said, email me if you want some advice. But here's the but. If you have PCOS, you can do just fine on a low-carb or ketogenic diet without these supplements. The diet alone is powerful enough to bring down insulin and have a beneficial cascading impact on the other hormonal abnormalities responsible for your signs and symptoms. Supplements might give you a little extra edge, but honestly, the diet will be responsible for the vast majority of improvement. A lot of the keto doctors I know don't really recommend supplements. They get all the effects they get with their patients, reversal of type 2 diabetes, reversal of PCOS, reversal of metabolic syndrome without supplements. So now let's talk about, I have a section, diabetes drugs for PCOS. This is interesting. It is telling that metformin and other diabetes drugs top the list of pharmaceutical interventions for women with PCOS. If PCOS had nothing to do with insulin and or blood sugar, why would anyone have ever bothered to research this, let alone have physicians actually prescribe these drugs for this condition as a regular course of action? They know this is the issue. They know it. And yet, how many women actually living with PCOS are told that it's the insulin? Hopefully, if you never heard this, you're hearing it now. I'm sorry that a nutritionist had to tell you. I'm sorry your OBGYN, your gynecologist, your doctor, your endocrinologist. I'm sorry none of them ever told you, but I hope if you've never heard it before that this is helping, even if it did have to come from some dumb nutritionist. Findings from studies looking at diabetes drugs for PCOS have been mixed, but overall, the evidence indicates these drugs are effective for improving insulin sensitivity, reducing androgen levels, and restoring normal menstruation. And I give 3 links to 3 different studies with diabetes drugs. In one study, lean and obese women with PCOS were treated with either metformin or rosiglitazone, which is another diabetes drug, for 12 weeks. In all groups, HOMA-IR, fasting insulin, area under the curve for insulin, and C-peptide levels decreased. C-peptide is a measure of insulin production. It's not insulin itself, but it's a measure of insulin. Metformin therapy resulted in regular menstruation in nearly 42% of lean and 36% of obese patients who had menstrual disturbance at the start of the study. Rosiglitazone therapy improved menstrual disturbance in 61.5% of the lean and 53% of obese patients. So if you're dealing with PCOS, sure, you could take diabetes drugs, or here's an alternative. Here's a wacky alternative to taking diabetes drugs when you don't have diabetes. Or you could reverse your PCOS eating juicy steaks, bacon, fatty pork chops, grilled asparagus, roast chicken with crispy skin, mushroom sauteed in butter, and all other manner of extremely delicious, very low-carb foods. You do you, but I know which one I'd choose. And these are not mutually exclusive. You can do a keto diet and start on some of the medications or supplements I mentioned with an eye toward weaning off of them as your metabolic condition improves, right? You don't have to just do keto or just do supplements. Do it all. And as you get well, adjust as needed. It boggles my mind why low-carb or ketogenic diets are not standard of care for women with PCOS. It is an absolute slam dunk, and I can only speculate that the reason it's not the first immediate go-to strategy is simply that most doctors just don't know. The main piece of advice they give is probably to lose weight if the perspective is that PCOS is caused by being overweight. But what do doctors tell thin women with PCOS? I have no idea. Take your metformin and see you in 6 months would be my guess. This is an absolute travesty, and we should be furious about it. If you know someone with PCOS, consider them sending a link to this post or a link to this video. It's my hope that they'll see they are most definitely not helpless, and the situation is not hopeless. They are not at the mercy. If you, I will say you now instead of they, if you are living with PCOS, you are not at the mercy of inexplicable imbalances in hormones. There's one hormone that is affecting all the others, and it is insulin. Regulate the insulin, regulate the others, and control PCOS with food. Control PCOS with food, not with diet food, not with cardboard, not with alfalfa sprouts, not with tofu, with fatty steaks, with grilled ribeye, with pork chops, with bacon, with ham and cheese omelets, with roasted Brussels sprouts, with olive oil and balsamic vinegar, with the most delicious divine food. You can reverse your PCOS. No need for starvation, deprivation, rabbit food, or innumerable hours on treadmills or elliptical machines. Okay. If you need help getting started with keto, I'm available. That's pretty much the end of the blog post, but I mentioned that I'm available. So I hope this wasn't weird. I chose to read that entire post because I knew if I was just talking off the cuff, I would forget something. And, you know, maybe it was a little too detailed, me talking about all those studies. But like I said, this is a slam dunk. I cannot fathom why this is not the standard of care. So if you have PCOS or you know somebody who does, maybe send them a link to the blog, because the video, I know maybe it's a little stunted. I was looking at the papers, but I would love to help. I would love to help because I think PCOS is so very easily managed, if not reversed altogether, right? Some of you might even know, you might even be one of the women who had PCOS and struggled to conceive for years and years, and you did a low carb or ketogenic diet, and oops, you got unexpectedly pregnant. You might have not been on birth control, or your husband, spouse, significant other, boyfriend may not have protected himself because you just assumed that you're infertile. You assumed you're not going to conceive, so why? I just changed my diet. I mean, that doesn't affect PCOS, right? And boom, you conceived a child. Or you know, we call those like the accidental keto babies. Maybe you had a deliberate keto baby. Maybe you knew that this was going to work for you, so you purposely did it for that reason. You know, whatever it is. I personally don't want to have children. I'm not the mothering type, but I know so many women do want to be moms. And if you have a dream of being a mom and you're struggling with PCOS and it's not happening, contact me, 2atnutrition.com. There's a tab that says work with me. You can book a consultation. You can change PCOS with food. I don't guarantee it. I can't promise it, but good Lord, compared to the other treatments, which is basically nothing, it's diabetes drugs, if anything, I don't know why you wouldn't do this. You could give it a try for 6 months, and if it doesn't work, guess what? Like, if you literally have zero improvement in anything, the acne, the mood swings, the oily skin, the hair, the, you know, the whacked out menstruation, the missing menstruation, whatever, any of that, if you don't lose weight, if you have weight to lose, all that stuff, go back to your regular diet. But you could give this a try. That's all. It's such an important issue, and it's not being talked about enough. And maybe keto alone isn't going to be enough for some women. Even maybe keto with supplements, with medication is going to elevate it. Maybe then you do need a little bit of physical activity, not because it helps you lose weight, but because it helps insulin sensitivity. That's a good thing about exercise. Or more sunlight, more sleep, stress management. All of these things affect insulin sensitivity. I think the diet is going to go the vast majority of the way to doing what needs to be done hormonally, but I'm just sort of putting it out there that maybe there's going to be some other tweaks. Start with the ketogenic diet, see how far it gets you, then maybe play around with some of the other stuff. That's it. Thank you for watching. As always, remember you can support me on Patreon, patreon.com/2itnutrition. You can support me for as little as $2 a month. Higher amounts are much appreciated. I'm self-employed. I have no health insurance. I have no retirement plan. And so what else? That's Patreon. If you don't like Patreon, I know many people don't, you can still support me using PayPal, paypal.com. You can send a one-time or recurring donation to my email address, 2itnutrition@gmail.com. Or you are more than welcome to just watch and absorb and learn from this content for free. Hopefully you do learn from it. And that's it. I will see you next time. Bye.